a very warm welcome to this edition of Europe Calling, this time in cooperation between my dear colleague Anna Cavazzini, Chair of the Internal Markets and Consumer Protection Committee in the European Parliament, MEP, Green MEP from Saxony, and myself, Sven Giegold, the spokesperson of the German Greens in the European Parliament. And this time we are discussing about a hot issue, the Energy Charter, and we will be looking forward to expertise around this. I will not introduce into the subject, that is what Anna has promised to do. I will only introduce briefly how we work here. So we first listen to the insights of our experts. You can't see at the moment one of our experts, who is Jutta Paulus. You can see actually sometimes a little bit of, there she is. So another Green MEP from Rheinland-Pfalz, which is one of the funniest Länder in Germany, for all those who don't know it so well. And the point is, the way how it works is, we will listen first to the experts. During that time, you can put your comments or questions into the F&A function. And by that way, we will see all your comments and questions, and you can give a thumb up to those which you find most interesting and most relevant. And we will first read those so that many people will have the opportunity to influence what we will be discussing. And beyond that, all this here is recorded. So therefore, please keep in mind, if you ask questions and give us your name, it will be recorded as well. And we will put the recordings later on YouTube so that more people can actually listen to what we will be discussing. And lastly, I would like to say this is only part of a larger webinar series, which has already reached 70,000 people. So it's a big effort to bring European politics closer to citizens and with experts, with decision makers. And this is what we actually are doing today. And I now hand over to Anna, only with the last wish, so that we reach as many people as possible. Don't hesitate, please don't hesitate to share strong things which have been said on social media. So please take the message out so that more people will be reached with the information which is being shared with us today. And now a great webinar. I'm looking forward to nearly 2 hours of learning. And now to Anna, please.
Yes, thank you very much, Sven. And also, sorry again for being a little bit late, but sometimes, yeah, the technical parts don't work. And thanks to Jutta for giving me asylum in her office. I'm very, very, very happy that we organized this webinar, because indeed the Energy Charter Treaty is a topic very close to my heart, and I think sometimes overlooked when it comes to the fight against the climate crisis, but nevertheless very, very important to look at. So I think, and I hope with this webinar we also contribute a little bit to spread the word to, as Sven also said, get more knowledge on what the Energy Charter Treaty is, why it is hampering the energy transition, and also, of course, fighting and strategizing on solutions. I'm sure all of you, or a lot of you who are participating in the webinar, probably know about this infamous ISDS system, because when people were on the street protesting against TTIP and CETA, it was also about these investor-to-state dispute settlement provisions, where investors, foreign investors, can basically sue governments for legitimate decisions that pursue public policy objectives. The Energy Charter Treaty is a multilateral treaty that has basically as its heart such an ISDS provision, and it protects very much fossil fuels. So in the course of history, there had been already more than 130 ISDS cases being triggered, where like foreign investors sued governments because of political decisions. There were like over 42 billion damages being paid out. So you see, it's also very, very costly. And there is still 345 billion of fossil fuel infrastructure protected under ISDS, and why and under the Energy Charter Treaty. And why this is a problem is, of course, because we need a very speedy energy transition. We need to get out of fossil fuel. But if fossil fuel, on the other hand, is protected, there is, of course, a very big contradiction. And I'm sure all the very distinguished experts and speakers we have here tonight will anyhow comment on this. So I don't want to go deeper into that. I just want to explain why this topic is politically so important, and very quickly say on what we have been doing in the European Parliament on that. But I'm sure we also come back on that during the discussion. There has been now a lot of, let's say, attention within the European Parliament for a couple of months now on the Energy Charter Treaty. And this is, of course, very, very good. I think it was because civil society was so active, but also because, I guess we as the Greens had been very loud in the European Parliament on criticizing the Energy Charter Treaty. There is a so-called modernization process going on at the time. So the Commission, the EU Commission, acknowledged that there is a problem, but of course doesn't use probably the most radical or the most progressive avenue at the moment, but tries to still modernize, to basically amend the treaty. We as Greens think it is very, very hard to amend the treaty and kick fossil fuel protection out of it. So our political line at the moment is that we should just exit the treaty, because it is hampering the energy transition. It's hard to reform, almost impossible to reform. And we don't want it to be a problem in the future. We see already a lot of cases, for example, a German, international investor suing, for example, the Netherlands because of the coal exit. So this is just a very brief introduction. I think we will have a lot of more details now in the different inputs we're having. And I believe, Sven, it's also my role now to introduce the speakers, or will you do it? I'm doing it. Okay, perfect. Just to, because I don't want to, of course, take your task, I will then directly hand over to the speakers. And if there is, in the course of the day or of the evening, questions on the Parliament positions, on what we as Greens in the European Parliament are doing, I'm sure that Jutta and me will also come in again and explain a little bit more. So first presenter tonight is an old colleague of mine, former colleague of mine and good friend, Cornelia Maarfield, who works for CAN Europe. And she is definitely working at a very interesting interface between trade and climate. And we don't have so many people in Europe who exactly work on this connection between trade and climate. So it is, I guess, very interesting to hear from her on what the Energy Charter Treaty is, what are the problems more in general, but also, of course, what the civil society is doing at the moment. So Cornelia, please.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction. Actually, I was asked to speak in German, so if you would like to follow me in English, then please turn on the interpretation now. It's a bit funny because I'm the only one now speaking in German, I believe. Ja, also guten Abend allerseits, Cornelia Maarfield.
So, good evening, everyone. I'm Cornelia Maarfield from the Climate Action Network Europe. We're a network of climate protection NGOs that are active in all of Europe. As Anna already said, I work mostly on trade and climate, and the whole topic of investment is very important there, and we're focusing there on the Energy Charter Treaty and its role that it could play in the energy transition. I will briefly address what the Energy Charter Treaty actually is so that everyone understands. And I will also say why we consider it an obstacle to the clean energy transition, and also address the reform process and the question whether that will solve the problem. I just need to briefly check how I can continue here. Right, so here on the map, you can see the member states of the Energy Charter Treaty. In Europe, it's almost all the countries, and then you can see it sort of continues to eastward, Central Asia, up to Japan. The reason for this is that it's a treaty that came about in the post-Soviet time in order to facilitate investment by Western companies in Eastern countries and to secure those investments. As Anna has already said, this protection of investments occurs through clauses in the treaty that grant quite far-reaching rights to the investors, and they can claim these rights by filing a claim against a state in front of a so-called arbitral tribunal. That's the Investor State Dispute Settlement, ISDS. And there have been as many ISDS claims under this treaty as there haven't been under any other treaty, 135 so far. So there are a number of things that we criticize about this ISDS procedure. One is that there's a lot of money at stake. First of all, the suits themselves in front of the tribunal are very costly for the states, everything that needs to be done there, and the ministries and the arbitrators that need to be paid. For instance, Germany, in one such case where a claim was filed by Vattenfall against Germany because of the nuclear phase out, Germany had to pay several tens of millions in order to follow that suit. Also, the tribunal can award very high damages or compensation to the investors, and the procedure is highly secretive. There are claims that are filed that we don't even know about because under certain arbitration rules, they don't even have to be made public. And if we do hear about them, then we usually only hear that there is a claim. It's not made public what arguments the investor is using or what the sums are that they're claiming. And even the result of the arbitration doesn't have to be made public if the investor doesn't agree. Further, there's a significant conflict of interest on the side of the arbitrators. They can sometimes be sort of like judges as arbitrators, but at the same time, there are sometimes lawyers for some of the parties involved in the arbitration, which is, of course, makes it difficult for them to be independent. And also, they have an interest in dealing with as many cases as possible because they are paid on a case-by-case basis, as opposed to judges who have a fixed employment at a court. So because they have an incentive to have as many cases as possible, there is an outright industry that is formed around this, around these procedures, and they deal with very high sums. So the result is not just that the arbitrators accept more cases, but also take interpretations of the treaty that are favorable to the investors in order to get more cases. Further, these arbitration results are highly enforceable once a result has been reached, and for instance, a certain compensation has been awarded to the investor, then there is no opportunity for appeal. And if the government doesn't want to pay, then the investor can impound the assets of the government going through other courts. So in any case, the investor will get their money from the government. I will address some examples now because otherwise it won't become specific enough. So before the suit that was already mentioned, there was an earlier suit against the German government, which was related to a power plant in Hamburg, and that required a water use permit. And the question was how much water this power plant was allowed to extract from the Elbe River. And the requirement that Hamburg had stated was too restrictive for the company's taste. So the company Vattenfall filed a claim for 1.4 billion euros of compensation. And 2 years later, there was a settlement. The case was settled with Hamburg agreeing to relax the environmental restrictions to lower the standards. So that tells you how much this Energy Charter treaty can lead to pressure being put on government to lower their environmental or social standards. There's also a case of the Italian company of Rockhopper. They wanted to build an oil platform in the Adriatic, and they had already invested 29 million US dollars, but Italy passed a ban on such drillings in coastal, in the vicinity of the coast. And now on the basis of the Energy Charter Treaty, this company is filing a claim for almost the 10 times the amount in compensation, 275 million US dollars. So that's one of the things about this treaty, that the companies can not only recover the costs they actually paid, but their actual losses, but rather they can say, I would have made the following profit if I could have built this platform. And the arbitrators then often come up with very high sums in compensation on that basis. Further, the company takes no financial risk in filing this claim, but even though there are lots of lawyer costs, they have third-party financiers. If they win, then the financier gets a percentage of the compensation. If they lose, they don't have to pay. So that is another factor facilitating such claims. And further, Italy is not even a member anymore of the ECT, but there's a clause, so-called sunset clause, that causes them to be liable for another 20 years after exiting. There's also a case of the Netherlands that Freek will be saying more about later. So I will talk more about the German coal phase out now, where the lignite operators are to receive 4.35 billion euros in compensation. In return, the operators waive their rights under the Energy Charter Treaty. This is in paragraph 24 of the public-private contract that they've made with the operators. And the German environmental ministry in Germany writes on their website that these enormous sums are being paid in return for the waiver of the rights. And this sum is probably far too high. Some people have tried to calculate what should actually be paid to the companies. For the LEAG company, the result is according to a study by Ember and Beat, which was commissioned by the German Economic Ministry. They arrive at just 1.5 billion euros. However, one should add that coal is only the tip of the iceberg. It's only part of the protected investments. According to a calculation by Investigate Europe, roughly 344 billion euros of investments have been placed in fossil assets that are protected under the Energy Charter Treaty. But coal only makes up 6% of this. The claims are currently being filed with respect to coal, because the coal phase out is currently an issue, but no country has started phasing out gas and gas pipelines and oil. And especially Germany is very much at risk of further claims in the future. For instance, countries like Denmark are only even now investing in gas in the course of their coal phase out. So if we look at the energy transit as a whole, then we are only seeing the first claims, and it could become a huge issue once the states actually make Paris-compatible climate policies. The Energy Charter Treaty is also viewed critically by the European Commission. It is considered obsolete, and there are attempts to make it compatible with the Paris Climate Treaty, but also with EU law. There's a process for that started in last July, and there have been 5 negotiation rounds already. The largest roadblocks that hinder this reform are these red stars here. First of all, there needs to be unanimity among the 53 contracting parties that have already been mentioned. That makes it very difficult if you have to get all of them together. Then there's a very narrow scope. The topics that have been set up for the negotiations are very narrow, and only those can be discussed. That doesn't include some points that we find very important. Also, you can observe a lack of ambition on the part of many of the contracting parties. You can see that in the proposals of the EU as well. What can be said in favor of the EU is at least that have they have published their proposals at least, but so we have an idea there where the proposals are going. What this process will not solve is that ISDS is not one of the topics being discussed. The arbitration procedure is not being discussed at all, and that's a big problem for the EU because there's an incompatibility there with EU law, according to an opinion of the European Court of Justice, which is not just solved by this reform. So even if the reform goes through, it will still not be the treaty will still not be compatible with EU law, and so that makes it a bit difficult to get your hopes up corresponding with respect to this process. Also, the excessive compensations that I already mentioned are not addressed there. And finally, also whether fossil fuels remain protected or become excluded from the protection. Even the EU proposal does not suggest to remove the fossil fuels from protection. Even under the most ambitious proposal, the fossil fuels would still be protected even 10 years after the treaty is ended. So maybe at some point in the 30s, one could then end the investment protection for fossil fuels, but that is of course far too late because we need to be very active now in ending fossil fuels. What's more is that the agreement might even become more dangerous through the reform because the EU is suggesting that certain forms of hydrogen and biomass might fall under the protection of the Energy Charter Treaty. It's hard to understand how they came up with this idea because there is at the same time a process in the EU for biomass. And they're realizing now that if you throw entire trees into the fire, that might not be the best possible use of that important resource and an important CO2 sink. So there will be a lot of legislation in the near future that will have to make regulatory changes with respect to hydrogen and biomass, and that can then again be challenged under the Energy Charter Treaty. So that's another big risk that might be coming up. So to summarize, we have a very low opinion of this reform. It will not lead to the desired results, and therefore we ask the European states to withdraw from the treaty, and there is increasing support for this. France, Spain, and Luxembourg have shown themselves to be open to this. And also from the European Parliament, there has been a lot of approval for a statement that demands this withdrawal if the modernization fails. And this actually was carried across parties from Social Democrats, Liberals, and Greens, and up to the left. We started a petition that had 1 million signatures within 2 weeks for withdrawing from the European Charter Treaty, an Energy Charter Treaty. Some prominent people from the energy and climate debate turned to the contracting parties, and there is now a growing groundswell of NGOs and civil society organizations that are demanding this. So we do hope to convince the members of the Energy Charter Treaty that the reform has failed and that instead they should go on with withdrawal.
Thank you so much, Cornelia, for this overview. I think now everyone who hasn't heard about the Energy Charter Treaty before, where we're at. Thank you so much for this. Let's move over to the next panelist. I've mentioned it before. There has just been a new case. The Netherlands is being sued. We have Freek Bersch from the Milieudefensie, Friends of the Earth, here with us today, and he will speak a bit about this case, this example. That's what's going on in Netherlands. It's a lighthouse example because we decide to phase out coal and then we're sued. So Fred, over to you. You have the floor, approximately 10 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, and apologies for the slightly weird angle and maybe shaky screen. I just moved into a new house, so I don't have a proper desk with an internet connection yet. Yeah, we have the dubious honor to be the first and second country to be sued under the Energy Charter Treaty directly for climate policy. Something activists have been warning about for years has happened now against the Netherlands. So we have two claims, two ISDS claims under the Energy Charter Treaty, both by coal companies, by RWE and by Uniper. RWE is claiming $1.4 billion, and Uniper is they didn't make their claim public, but earlier they said they think their plant is still worth about 850 million to about $1 billion. And the interesting thing about the case is that they argue the plants are pretty new. They were built in they were opened in 2015, the year of the Paris Climate Agreement, and they claim that the Dutch government has asked them to build the power plants, and that's what they're referring back to now, claiming that the fact that they have to close it down, or at least that they have to stop burning coal, is a breach of their rights under the Energy Charter Treaty, or possibly also under Dutch or EU law, because at least RWE is also trying to is also preparing a case for a regular judge. So and that's of course one of the crazy things about the Energy Charter Treaty, that it makes it possible to have two parallel cases about the same subject, and they can see whichever is the most favorable for them. Now, the reason that they are claiming compensation is because they have to stop burning coal in 2030. So the Netherlands has adopted a coal phase out, which is not forcing them to close down the plants, but it's forcing them to stop burning coal. So if they figure out some other way to keep the plants open, that's fine according to this law. So biomass or something else. Of course, without subsidies, that's probably not viable. So they see it as a forced expropriation, so that's also a little bit of a bit of a technical term from the Energy Charter Treaty and from ISDS treaties. And they're claiming that they had the legitimate expectation that they could have the benefits of this plan for many years to come, basically until the end of the lifespan, which would be about 40 years. So they're claiming $1 billion, almost $1.5 billion. And this is also interesting in light of market developments of the worth of coal power. One of our allies, SOMO, a research organization in the Netherlands, has investigated what's a coal plant worth these days. Are they making a profit? And they found out that basically both these plants are making a loss since 2019 already, and the expectation is that the loss will only grow towards 2030. So the question is there actually a real base for them to claim any compensation, because they are making a loss just by market demand, the market situation, and not by this coal phase out. So in the end, it might actually be possible that the coal phase out itself wasn't necessary, that they would close down anyway, because the market situation just doesn't make it interesting anymore to keep running. And there's an interesting parallel with a German coal plant. I think it's the same one as we saw earlier in Hamburg. I understand that this coal plant has been closed down already, or is being closed down soon, and that they received about 240 million euros by the German government in compensation, or more or less that number. And the interesting thing is that this coal plant was also opened in 2015, the same year as the Dutch coal plants. That it is more or less the same capacity. So it's very comparable. It's also in a harbor, just like the two Dutch ones. So a very comparable situation also for their market position. And there they received 240 million. So that's way less than what RWE and Uniper is claiming. The problem is, of course, that we don't know how the arbiters will look at this information, and that the ECT gives such a wide range of possibilities for them to go, and that is actually common for them to award sort of basically lost future profits. And it's very hard to predict where that will go. It's in the Netherlands. We are. I think I already need to wrap up regarding time. In the Netherlands, we are focusing now in our lobby towards politicians, the Dutch government, on transparency on this case, and this is going quite well. It looks like all the documents will be public, save parts that might have competitive sensitive issues, but most documents should be made public. The hearings will be public, probably, and there will be a possibility for amicus briefs. So organizations will have the possibility to write to the arbitration panel with their perspective. So this is, well, interesting because we will know more about the case than in many other ISDS cases. It's also, I think, very interesting campaign-wise, because the knowledge that we will have about the case will make it easier for us to address the problems of the process and of the contents of this claim. And to wrap up, is basically what probably all other speakers will say in their own words. You know, the core of the problem here is, of course, you know, that these two cases will most likely not be the only ones putting claims forward against climate policies. And we know that we need to keep more than 80% of coal, oil, and gas in the ground. That there is many fossil fuel infrastructure that we won't be able to keep open until the end of their lifespan. And that many of these assets, many of these investments will be covered by the Energy Charter Treaty or by one of many other treaties that have ISDS and protect these investments. And the essence in the end is that this makes our climate policy more expensive because, of course, we have to pay for these claims, or we have to negotiate compensation to prevent these claims. And in these negotiations, these settlements that we might have to make with companies, that makes the entire process more difficult, and in the end, possibly also slower. So the energy transition will slow down because of these processes and all these settlements and all these things that governments will have to come up with to prevent getting claims. The Dutch example is an example of that, in the sense that they didn't decide to have a coal phase out that says we have to close down these plants. No, they said they wanted to prevent claims by saying we're only forbidding them to burn coal, and it didn't work. But they did try to figure out something to go around it. And that will prove a big problem for such an urgent issue, and something that we cannot use.
Thank you very much for this insight from the Netherlands. I think in the course of the evening, it will be probably also interesting to hear a little bit about the public debate in the Netherlands, because I mean, I assume that such a case also changes a little bit the public discourse. But let's go directly to the next speaker, the last expert we are having today. Lise Johnson is leading the work of the Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment at the Columbia Law School, and is a very renowned expert and researcher on ISDS, and also, of course, on ISDS reform. So I think it would be very interesting to hear from you, Lise, a little bit more about also some legal implications, also how you assess the reform endeavors that are going on at the moment, and probably you can also say something on this infamous sunset clause that Cornelia explained, because of course what we hear as parliamentarians very often from the Commission is that the exit is not possible or very, very bad for us. Yeah, because you have a 20-year sunset clause that protects investment. So probably you can also refer to this argument. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for the invitation. And I just want to say I really appreciated the presentations that just preceded me, and learned a lot, and so clear. I lead the work at Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment, and have been following ISDS cases for the past 13 years, and find that cause for concern about them has only increased. So what I want to do, maybe kind of, I'll talk about the issues just mentioned, and I also thought it might be good to highlight several areas of environmental protection and environmental justice that are affected by ISDS, including, of course, these particular measures relating to climate action, but as well as kind of associated issues of areas of protection of water resources, preparation of environmental impact assessments, and issues relating to communities' rights to participate in kind of the fate or development of projects and their access to justice. And the reason that I wanted to highlight those is just to emphasize that concerns around the ECT are not just, I mean, there definitely are concerns about unduly protecting fossil fuel investments, but they're also about ensuring a just transition. And so the extraction of natural resources, that will likely accompany a shift to a no carbon society, for instance, that will also create an social, economic, and environmental harms, or creates a risk of those harms. And we need to mitigate those harms through careful governance. And the concern is that ISDS, based on past practices, will actually exacerbate those harms. So I'll just provide some examples that are often based on other treaties, but they look very similar to the ECT. So I think the lessons from some of the other cases are also translatable to the ECT. So one is, of course, on climate action. So I'll start there. And we know that trillions of dollars of investment, new investment, are required to meet the growing demands for clean energy. And significant investments in fossil fuel extraction, transmission, and processing have to be urgently phased out or halted. And we know from past cases that measures to shift away from the status quo are the types of measures that will impact and give rise to ISDS cases. And we've already started seeing the cases in the climate context. So there were a couple of examples of the RWE and Uniper cases just discussed. In the US, we saw one in 2015. After following years of delay, the US government had rejected TransCanada, a Canadian company's construction permit to build the Keystone XL pipeline. President Obama announced that the pipeline would undercut government efforts to make the US a leader in climate action. And in response, TransCanada initiated a $15 billion claim against the US, seeking compensation for future lost profits. Ultimately, TransCanada suspended that case after President Trump was elected and approved the permit. Now, with President Biden, the project has again been stalled, and there are rumors that the case will be relaunched. Another example was in 2015, a new government in Alberta, a province of Canada, announced its climate leadership plan, which would include compensation for the early closure and eventual phase out of coal-fired power plants by 2030. In response, we saw Westmoreland, whose mine had supplied coal to the majority of the phased out operations, filed an ISDS suit alleging that Alberta's compensation for the power plants, but not for the coal mines, violated Canada's obligations under the NAFTA. And it's claiming over $350 million in damages. Another case, Lama Energy Group, brought a claim against Canada under the Czech Canada BIT, arguing that the government had violated the investment treaty by unduly delaying in granting environmental permits for extraction and transmission of tar sands, of a tar sands project. It then received regulatory approval for that project, despite the pushback from Indigenous groups who claim the activities are going to put sacred lands and drinking water at risk. So there we saw the threat of ISDS, or the actual ISDS claim, and then the reversal of the government's measure. So again, we also have implications for governance of water resources being raised in ISDS claims. And I think that issue to manage water resources is an issue that, again, is going to become especially important as a result of climate change. Cornelia gave the two examples, one related to Vattenfall and Rockhopper, a couple others that I'll provide. Romania, for instance, did not issue environmental permits for a Canadian company's gold and silver mine, in part for fear of cyanide pollution over the water resources. That company, Gabriel Resources, then filed a claim for $4.4 billion in damages against Romania. Then again in Canada, Lone Pine, which holds permits for petroleum and natural gas exploration, is claiming over $100 million from Canada for a moratorium imposed on fracking due to environmental concerns. So those are just some of the cases that that we are seeing that relate to environmental measures, governance of water resources, and also the rights, the respective relative rights of different stakeholders to participate and to shape governance of extractive industry and other projects. And really, they are kind of just the tip of the iceberg of what we are seeing. I encourage I'm encouraged by this really thoughtful and important discussion around the fate of the ECT. I think the issue of the sunset clause was raised as a potential barrier to future action. The sunset clause means that if you exit the ECT, that the investments will continue to be protected for another 20 years. Though researchers have identified, and practice has also identified, one possible solution is an inter se amendment, so amendment and a modification of the treaty by those who are withdrawing, which will then terminate the survival clause or amend the survival clause so as to shorten it, whether it's 10, 5, or 0 years. So thereby neutralizing its effect and reducing the impact of the survival clause. So there is a legal strategy to address that that I think is important to consider. I would echo also Cornelia's comments about kind of reform of the Energy Charter Treaty, the way that it's currently planned as being unsatisfactory for a number of reasons, including due to the lingering presence of ISDS and the kind of inability to address that through the reform, but also kind of the narrow focus on fossil fuel investments as opposed to the broader governance challenges that will be raised by the transition. So think that withdrawal from the ECT is feasible and is a crucial place to start. And really, I'm encouraged by this discussion because investment governance has a really crucial role to play in shaping investment flows and on the impacts of investment for sustainable development. And we've seen enough ISDS cases to illustrate the risks of putting strongly enforceable investor protections at the heart of investment governance. So we now really need to think about how to redesign that governance for the 21st century, putting people and planet really at the core of that governance system. So maybe I'll stop there and look forward to the discussion.
Yeah, thank you, Lise, for this insight and for also bringing it again on the more abstract level of why we talk about investment protection and how to make it right, because it has a lot of impact or huge impact on the green transition, on the sustainability revolution. So before I hand over to Sven for the question and answers, my colleague Jutta will comment, because of course she's also working on the ECT together with me in the European Parliament and can probably say something of what we are debating in the European Parliament at the moment. We switched seats.
Yes, this is a rather precarious tale of books in order to bring the screen to the correct height. So better not touch it; it might fall down. Well, to start with my comment to Lise, at least it's not only the Europeans that were so stupid to fall into the ISDS trap. You have just given us a very great overview that it's basically happening all over the world. And actually, my question, I mean, I'm not here to ask questions, but I'm really interested, how did this happen? How did independent states, democracies, fall into this trap to give themselves into the hands of non-elected, non-supervised, very strange courts, which are not really courts, right? So the mindset behind this is, I guess, something that we really have to explore when we want to change this world for the better. And the second big takeaway is anonymity is a nuisance. And we all knew this, that we are working here in the European Parliament, because on really crucial things like tax politics or foreign policy, Anonymity in the council is something that is extremely hard to overcome, and we are only talking about 27 members, not about more than 50 like in the Energy Charter Treaty. So I guess that's something that we should keep in mind whenever we are joining whatever treaty in the future, that we have to find a way of not getting deadlocked basically by anonymity on certain issues. I found this map, which you showed in the very beginning, Cornelia. I found it very, very interesting because it shows that it's actually a treaty that spans around half the world. And of course, when we look at several of these states like Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Azerbaijan, those are states where a large part of the income is based on the selling of fossil fuels. So how can we even find a way to convince these governments to move away from fossil fuels and to be ready to reform the Energy Charter Treaty? I think it has to be something between putting pressure on them and bribery, because else we will not get out of this. And also I was very surprised to hear that the Energy Charter Treaty is the reason for the highest number of ISDS cases of all these treaties, which you have also mentioned, Lise. I wasn't aware that this was the case, and if I'm informed correctly, it's even accelerating in the recent years, especially because more and more countries are moving away from fossil fuels. So there's more reason for filing these claims. And another takeaway was, I didn't know that the judges too were paid according to the amount in dispute. I thought this was only the advocates of the respective parties. Well, Moorburg, I guess, was caught between a rock and a hard place, because it was not only an ISDS case being filed against environmental law, it was also an infringement procedure which the European Union filed because of the same environmental law, just from the other side. So maybe that might be part of the decision that Vattenfall took to apply for the closure premium after Moorburg had only been in operation for a very short time, actually. When we are looking at the Energy Charter Treaty, we of course have also to look at nuclear, because for us in Germany, we always think, well, who's talking about nuclear these days? It's a done deal. We have 6 plants running, which will close within the next 2 years. And no one could be so stupid as to build new nuclear power plants. It's incredibly expensive. You have all this waste you have to handle, and it takes ages until it comes into operation. And ever since we have seen the Hinkley Point case, where EDF is building a European pressurized reactor in UK, we know exactly how expensive nuclear is, because the operators applied to the UK government and said, we need a feed-in tariff of 12 cents per kilowatt hour over 35 years with a premium on top for inflation. So that might be 50 cents in 35 years. And at the same time, we see prices for wind and solar falling to well below 10 cents, sometimes even to below 5 cents, or when it comes to solar in Portugal, below 1.5 cents. So it's very clear which energy carrier is the most cost effective here. But still, I think nuclear is also for electricity companies or energy companies a very attractive investment, because the sums are so large. Of course, you could also claim in an ISDS procedure if you're denied building a wind park or something, but then we're talking about 3, 4, 5, 6 million maybe. And when we're talking about nuclear power, you could well add at least 3 zeros. So we're talking about billions there. And that, of course, might even be behind the plans of some of the companies to build those nuclear power plants, because then if there's legislation by the state which forbids it for environmental reasons, they could claim compensation under the Energy Charter Treaty. And I think we have to find a strategy on how we can avoid paying so much to get out of fossil fuels. And my personal take would be, forget about reforming the Energy Charter Treaty. We have to leave it as quickly as possible, and we have to try to tackle this treaty in court, because the circumstances have changed. For example, there were perfectly well-reasoned treaties when it came to the rights of a slave owner over his or her slaves. But then legislation changed, and all the treaties were void because legislation had changed. And we should find a way saying, well, now we have climate legislation, we have certain obligations, we have the Paris Agreement. So the circumstances have changed a lot, and we should be able to challenge the sunset clause due to this. And I would be very interested in hearing a thorough legal opinion on this, because I'm totally a layman when it comes to law. Thank you very much. Who will?
Yes, the two of you are really, that's looking great. I think that's a good couple. So thanks for these rather shocking talks. I have to say that is pretty stark, and that's also the impression it left with most who raised their voice here. I first take the privilege to ask one question directly to Lise. As in Germany, we are getting more and more fans of transatlantic relationship in these days. So the German Greens are really big Biden fans. I can say that, not on everything, of course, but he was much less sleepy than some claimed. But something which is really hard to understand to most Germans is, how can you even come across with such an idea as ISDS? So the whole idea is very hard to understand. So the philosophy of the social market economy, as we conceptualize it in Germany, and it has been integrated into the European treaties, is actually pretty simple. So you have free competition inside of a legal order. And the legal order is open to change after democratic votes. And of course, you have higher thresholds for constitutional changes than for simple legal changes. But now, this Energy Charter Treaty turns this economic order upside down. It basically says, if the citizens make the mistake to vote the wrong political parties, which change the democratic, the order for the free competition and the legal framework, then you get a bill. And the bill comes in the form of compensation payments. So this is why such claims are totally unsuccessful in German courts. So you couldn't go to a German court in this case. The bar is extremely high for the state to be abusive against investors. So Lise, as you are from Columbia University, and the Columbia University has such a great reputation, can you explain us, as old Europe, how such an idea could ever be defended, developed from a philosophical point of view? I really fail to understand it, and please help us. America, come to our support.
Well, I mean, those are great comments, and I think that the US actually doesn't understand it either. Just a few points on that. I mean, similarly, the domestic law protections that we would have are much narrower than would be available under ISDS. So if you look at our indirect expropriation claims, the rate of success, when I was looking at that a couple of years ago, something around 4%, and the amounts of compensation are a lot smaller than they would be under ISDS. So you have fewer claims succeeding because of what you said, that you give a lot of deference to legislatures, zoning officials, courts to alter the terms of property rights. I mean, that's part of the background principles. So our kind of property rights protections are much narrower than you would have under ISDS. And the FET, an equivalent of FET, doesn't exist in domestic law. And so Congress had kept telling kind of the negotiators, the executive, if you do investment treaties, we don't want you to give investors any greater rights than we have domestically. That's our cap. But as tribunals interpreted the treaties, they kept going beyond that. And what you've seen now is that the US is walking back from ISDS. So they recently renegotiated the NAFTA, and between the US and Canada, excluded ISDS. So that is no longer possible between the US and Canada investors from, and now I guess a couple of years. They put a small sunset provision because I think it had exceeded what they had envisioned from this system. So I think that might be a partial answer to the question. And it remains to a certain extent between the US and Mexico and Canada and Mexico. But my understanding is part of that is because Mexico wanted to retain some of those provisions. So we'll have to ask them why, what were the kind of the motivating factors behind retaining that. But I think you're right that there's much more questioning of why the system exists, what are its aims, is it meeting those? And when people are looking hard at those questions, they're saying, actually, the aims don't make sense, it's not really meeting them, let's do something else.
Thank you. So that was not quite a philosophical defense of the whole idea. Perhaps you are the wrong person to ask for that defense. However, it's true that actually this was invented by Germany in the first bilateral treaties. I know that, but however, it seemed in the past that it was America very strongly defended on the international level. However, but perhaps the Netherlands can come to our defense. Milieudefensie, perhaps you can explain us the whole mess. So, Freek.
I'm not sure if I can explain the whole mess, but I think at least part of it. I think the Netherlands has also played quite a big role in the history of ISDS. I think the Netherlands was the first country to have an actual investment treaty with ISDS in it, together with Indonesia. And that is, of course, already telling. I'm not exactly sure about the order. I think the Netherlands has the first treaty. Germany might have invented the system, but the Netherlands maybe was a bit faster with implementing it. I don't know how exactly that works, but
we are quite happy if you take the blame. So that's good. So,
yeah. Right. And actually, it was also a Dutch Prime Minister early 90s that took the initiative for an energy plan after the Soviet fell apart that resulted in the Energy Charter Treaty. So we have a very interesting track record. But that first treaty together with Indonesia is, I think, very telling. And that is many of the German BITs, many of the early BITs were with former colonies, of course. It was, I think, simply a way to make sure that our Western companies that were still present there or wanted to invest in those countries had sort of a Western standard of protection. And a reaction last year in the Dutch Parliament was very telling in this regard. A response to the fact that we were sued by RWE, by the Christian Democrats, a party that always defended these kind of treaties, and it was always in favor. Their response was, if we are being sued now, then I'm not sure if we can still support these kind of treaties. So they are looking at it from a perspective that this is for failed states, for weak democracies, etc. But it's not possible that we are actually being sued. The fact that many Western European countries and then the United States and Canada and other countries were already being sued was never an issue for them. But when the Netherlands was being sued, then suddenly they realized this can be turned against us. And I think that, yeah, that is basically very telling in how ISDS came about and how, yeah, what happens when it's us that's being sued.
This was your Christian Democrats.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we can learn again that in the Bible you find that all are equal before God, but you are not equal in front of your Christian Democrats. So they're very confusing for me. But however, let's go, before I make more nasty comments, to some of the more serious questions here of the audience. So this is now in German. So who can't deal with this, please get on the English channel. I'll start with Sasha Gajewski. Da aufgrund der Sunset.
Since, due to the sunset clause, even 20 years after withdrawal from the treaty, claims can be filed, would a withdrawal from the treaty not be ineffective for reaching climate goals? Would it not be more conducive to focus on making industries, for instance, coal, unprofitable, so that no compensation can be claimed because there are no longer any profits to be had? I think a legal expert must have been at work here. I'll hand this question to Jutta because you already went into tactical issues. And this also reminds me of some tactical discussions about our election platform, how we can get rid of coal without feeding more money to the fossil fuel industry. Well, as we already heard, the calculation of the profits are quite adventurous and actually outlandish. And the problem is that we don't have an appeal here. In Germany, where a lot of money is being thrown in the direction of the companies, the European Commission is even checking whether it's feasible what the German government is paying. Is that actually being, is that in any relation to actual expectations of profit, or is that actually state aid under the mantle of compensating companies? But there is, if even the arbitrator has an interest of making the sum as high as possible, then of course some fantasy numbers will always be made up. So I don't think that would protect us against these high sums, because we don't have any control. There's no appeal. In the case of the coal-fired power plants in the Netherlands, the payment would have to be much lower, and Vattenfall also got a huge payout due to the nuclear phase-out with reference to fictitious prices for nuclear power that have no basis in current energy prices. I would maybe like to add to that it's also an issue which policies result in fossil fuels becoming unprofitable. Many of the regulations that states could use to make that are precisely the regulations that can be challenged under the Energy Charter Treaty, because the point is that under the treaty, the investors have been guaranteed a stable regulatory setting. And in the past, various arbitral tribunals have interpreted this to mean that any regulatory change that causes the company to no longer be able to operate as it has been used to, as it claims to have reasonably expected at the time it made the investment, it can then file a claim for compensation. Of course, this is a question of interpretation for the arbitral tribunals, and we will certainly intervene in these arbitral tribunals, because when RWE and Uniper commissioned coal-fired power plants in the Netherlands, it's a joke. They've known for decades that climate change is a fact. They knew how detrimental coal is in this respect. And if they assumed that they would be allowed to burn coal for another 40 years, then they're just stupid, and then they are not, they don't deserve compensation. But we can't tell whether the arbitral tribunals will also view it that way. And unfortunately, it seems that they may not. And so we need to build pressure, public pressure, so that people actually realize what's being negotiated in these there behind the scene. And maybe I also have to mention what, as regards this sunset clause. Yes, if a state withdraws unilaterally from the treaty, then the sunset clause is activated, and claims can be filed against the state for another 20 years. But our goal is that as many states as possible withdraw from the treaty, ideally all EU member states, and hopefully also including countries like the United Kingdom and Switzerland, where we also have a lot of interconnection with respect to investment. And so that these states that withdraw from the treaty, that they would have an additional agreement, supplement agreement, saying that among them, the sunset clause would no longer be active, so it would no longer be possible to file claims from one of these countries against another of these countries. That would be the best possible scenario. The only way to completely pull its teeth, it would have to be completely rescinded, but unfortunately that would also require unanimity among all the contracting parties. And maybe that brings me back to the question of how the countries could even come up with the idea of getting into this treaty. And yes, they didn't maybe know what they were getting into. And as Freek already said, maybe they weren't expecting to be sued themselves. But unfortunately, this realization has still not arrived in some of the countries. For instance, the German government is still holding on to the Energy Charter Treaty because in their mindset, it's a treaty that's in favor of German companies. If, as the economic ministry or the trade part of that ministry, you see yourself as protecting the German interests abroad, then of course you are a great fan of such a treaty. But if you consider how important it is both for foreign countries and for Germany itself to shape the energy transition, and that they need leeway and scope for action to actually make policy decisions for that, and also to think of the interests of the taxpayers, then one would have to withdraw from the treaty. But unfortunately, the economic ministry does not seem to have accepted that yet.
Thank you so much. So when looking at here, there's one category that refers to so Jochen Möller be by the Federal Constitutional Court. Person asking European Court, how are the success rates for looking at the US? What is the opinion of the Supreme Court, or what's the perspective of the court? Now, where there something you also ask yourself in the Netherlands.
Ist von den niederländischen Gerichten zu erwarten, dass sie womöglich Kompensationszahlungen
is this something we can expect to see from the Netherlands?
Dann irgendwann auch für unwirksam erklären. Und kann es hier zu einem Rechtskonflikt zwischen nationalem Verfassungsrecht
Conflict between national treaty. Of course, usually international law breaks national or national law. So I would like to be interested to know this. I could probably say something on European Court of Justice before looking at the national situation already there. Those apply.
Und das ist auch die Rechtsauffassung der Kommission. Das Problem ist so ein bisschen, was
Commission.
dass das halt im Zweifel
Something we've heard before today. In the case of doubt, arbitrators
und deswegen ist es halt immer so eine schwierige Frage und deswegen ist eigentlich die Haltung der Europäischen Kommission auch, um wirklich sauber die innereuropäische Anwendung zu beenden, bräuchte es nochmal so einen Austrittsvertrag.
In the EU, and so what we would need would be a treaty between
Genau, nichtsdestotrotz, Belgien hat auch nochmal den EuGH angerufen, um genau das sozusagen auch nochmal zu klären, also ob sozusagen der Energiekartevertrag eigentlich mit europäischen
ECT
so vielleicht ganz kurz dazu übersetzen.
Will noch jemand anders dazu etwas
anyone
sagen?
else who would like to come in on that? Because I get even more confused by that. Should that be the case? Should this treaty contradict the European treaty? That may.
Vermutlich an den Schadensersatzforderungen, die dann auch noch 20 Jahre lang gelten, ändert das im Außenverhältnis vermutlich wieder nichts. Also da ist die Frage, ist der Vertrag auch sittenwidrig und ist damit erledigt? Vermutlich nicht, sondern wenn man, ich sage es mal zugespitzt, wenn die Scheiße mal am Schuh klebt, dann ist es schwer, sie wieder loszuwerden. Cornelia, vielleicht hast du da etwas Insight für uns.
Also es gibt zwei verschiedene Fragestellungen, wo der ECT vermutlich nicht mit europäischem Recht vereinbar ist. Und die Frage, die der Fragesteller gestellt hatte, bezog sich
There are two aspects in which the ECT is probably not compatible with EU law.
There
As
are
Anna already
examples
said,
that the
there
European Court
are
of Justice
signs that
would
the
apply.
European
would
Court of
see
Justice does not find the inner European application of the ECT compatible with EU law, and probably there will be a decision about this soon, because Belgium has asked the court to give an opinion on whether it finds the application of the ECT to be compatible with inner EU law. And many are assuming that the European Court of Justice will be we'll have to do something about this. There seems to be an interpretation that the ECT was never meant to be applied to inner EU situations, and so it would actually be quite easy for the EU member states to give a common declaration that would exclude application of the treaty to intra-EU cases, but this is currently being blocked by 6 contracting parties who are not willing to do that, but the Court of Justice of the EU could then make them do so. But this is really an approach that's being taken by countries like Germany and the Netherlands that are in favor of this treaty but don't want to be sued. and of course they would mostly be sued by EU member states, but we still want our companies to be able to sue other states, and of course it can't work that way. So we need to find a solution. So we need a withdrawal from the Energy Charter Treaty, and ideally that would work with more than just the EU member states.
Seems to be better with one of the translations. So, but both are still alive. So our interpreter Felix is now doing both directions. Thank you. So that is really a lot of work. Aha, German to English is now good. Aha, okay. So I'm now informed about these technical changes. I have not seen any wishes to respond from other countries' point of views. In this case, I would like to open another question, so which is of course a bit the obvious one, and I put it into my usual blunt language. Who the fuck was so stupid to actually sign this treaty? So which German minister has signed it, which government in which other country? So this question is raised several times in more or less polite language, but in the end it's this. So who signed it? Who is responsible? So the Russian question, whose guilt is it? So who's guilty?
Cool.
In Germany, Helmut Kohl. Okay, so what about America? So the Netherlands, who's guilty?
By the way,
Everyone.
the US is not a member of the Energy Charter Treaty, just to not confuse.
So they are analyzed. Thank you for correcting my obvious mistake. So okay, and in your case, Freek?
Everyone basically. Every party that was in parliament at the time didn't intervene. They all accepted it that this treaty came into force. So it was the Greens, it was the Socialist Party, it was the Social Democrats, the Christian Democrats, the Liberal Party, everyone.
Great. So this is consensus decision making at its worst, yeah? So
yes.
Looks complicated, nobody digs into it, so we all sign it off and that's it. And afterwards we have a mess. Great. I don't know who is now visible. She has a lot of books. I'm not sure whether this was on purpose, probably not. So, okay, so then let's, interpreter, the one with the microphone problem. So, okay, and so let's go on. And I would like to read one comment by Dr. Mark Reinstein. Frage zu Vattenfall Moorburg 2009.
Von Mark Reinstein. In 2009, Vattenfall filed a claim and didn't meet the requirements, but the building of the power plant already began in 2007. So it seems that requirements were changed during the construction. But so isn't it okay for the companies to defend themselves against such retroactive changes in requirements? Otherwise, no company would invest in Germany if there's no legal certainty, no matter what the subject is. Who wants to say something about that? Because I had mentioned this case as an example. The Vattenfall had actually started the construction with a temporary permit, a preliminary permit, and it was known that the water use permit was still pending. So the the company took certain risks deliberately, and there was a fundamental understanding between the then government of Hamburg and the company that there would be a permit, but the details were still pending. As Jutta Paulus said, Hamburg was bound to adhere to the water protection guideline. So by the water being taken from the Elbe River, the water heats up and the fish stock is endangered. And there is a nature reserve near the power plant. And in order to protect that nature reserve and to allow the fish there to live and to multiply, the city of Hamburg had to make these requirements. And as was already mentioned, when they lowered the requirements due to the company's claims, what ensued was a suit by the EU for them violating this guideline, this directive. So there was a certain calculation by the company under false assumptions that this power plant would be profitable, assuming that it would be able to take in more cooling water than turned out to be possible under environmental regulations. So it wasn't the case that there was a sudden change in regulations and the company was suddenly confronted with new facts.
My former professor at the University of Bremen, which I can't spare you, and but now I lost her here. That is a pity.
Dann kann ich vielleicht noch ganz kurz, Sven, solange du das suchst.
Sehr gut.
Maybe, Sven, while you're looking for that, I can say something as in reply, because I think something's very important to mention here. Companies always have normal legal avenues at their disposal. We've already mentioned this. Often there are parallel suits, domestic national lawsuits, and the arbitration in front of the arbitral tribunals. Not wanting to have arbitral tribunals of this form doesn't mean that one doesn't want to have legal certainty or legal security for the companies. They always have legal avenues available. And if they take the path of national courts and European courts, then the national and European law is the basis for the suit. Whereas in the case of the ISDS, these rather vague clauses of these treaties that can be interpreted very widely, such as, for instance, legitimate expectations, which can cover almost anything, can lead to very high sums. So I just want to make that point that companies should have legal certainty, and that will continue to be the case even if we withdraw from the Energy Charter Treaty. Okay, to draw this further into direction of economic theory towards the person who had asked that question, I would say that the possibility that the circumstances change also due to regulations is part of entrepreneurial risk. If I am active as an entrepreneur in a democracy, then I cannot claim that the voters have to leave all regulations exactly as they are. That's just part of the risk. And in return, the state grants them the freedom to make investments and to make profits from those investments. There is no right to compensation for the risk of democracy. So if someone declares democracy to be an illegitimate risk, that's a serious problem. And for my taste, there is far too little argumentation being brought forth on an international level on this very fundamental philosophical level, and there should be more of that. But before I give the floor to Ms. Paulus, I would like to bring in the University of Bremen.
Where I spent some years. So I find an answer to the question why democratic states fell to this trap in a study on France by Antoine Vaucher. The Neoliberal Republic, published, of course, at Cornell University Press 2021, arguing that first, revolving doors between the state and the economy, second, a new class of corporate lawyers, and third, the intransparency of their operations have systematically undermined the public good to the benefit of private gains. Full stop, and then there's a link to the book as a PR exercise. Thanks to Ulrike. So now Jutta, please.
Ja, auch nur ganz kurz. Also man muss sich noch mal, das ist ja vorhin gesagt worden.
Just very briefly.
Die Energy Charter Treaty ist ja überhaupt erst aufgesetzt.
Maybe this is easily forgotten. The Energy Charter Treaty was only
Judikative hat. Also das ist
signed because one was assuming that states did not have a proper justice system, that it would not be possible to go through the regular courts there, or that they would have sensible opinions. Of course, we got along very well without the Energy Charter Treaty, precisely because companies could go to regular courts. Only at that point, when people were arguing that these post-Soviet countries, who maybe after decades of totalitarian rule might not have functioning justice systems right away, that was the reason why this treaty came about in the first place.
Thrilling questions is going down, but some participants have raised their hand to speak in their microphone. I already know by experience that this sometimes happens just as an accident, but let's try. But I have to say, I don't have the rights to open their microphone. So staff had to do this. Now I can. Very nice. So Barbara Snow, please. Your microphone is, here we go.
I just wanted to remind that when TTIP was discussed in public, and all the different aspects of it, and the Schiedsgerichte, those courts, I remember reading that in the beginning, the parties that were now the investors are so privileged, and in the beginning it was supposedly the other way around. And there was a treaty cited between Germany and Pakistan, where apparently the German interests were very strongly weighted, and Pakistan was kind of overrun by the German interests, and so it was to the advantage of Germany and to the disadvantage of Pakistan. And so then, and that was at that time considered a good treaty in the beginning.
Thank you, Barbara. There are two more people who want to speak, and I'll give them the floor. So Alberto Amati. Pas encore. So, okay, I'll perhaps there's a problem with Alberto. You have still to switch on your microphone. For the time being, I'll try Gisela Toussaint.
Oh, thank you. I don't speak now. Thank you. I don't speak now.
Okay, thank you. Enjoy your evening. Gisela Toussaint. Your microphone is still muted.
Hello.
Yeah. Hello.
I have sent a note that there is a legal possibility to go to the International Court of Justice as a member state of the ECG. Ask to decide that the ECT is null and void. And it's very easy because you just need one single state who could start this Verfahren, and then this could join or not. That's not interesting because the court can say it is a null and void because of the Vienna, what is it called? Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties. There it is ruled that treaties like the ECT who what is it? Collapse, not collapsing.
Sie können Deutsch sprechen, es ist überhaupt kein Problem.
Also die Verträge, die
you can speak German, that's not a problem at all. So treaties that violate
das wäre hier die Lösung für den ECT und das wäre mit Sicherheit
laws be a solution. And it's something that's possible because, and I would also like to go back to what Jutta just said. Ms. Paulus, you said it rightly so. Policies change and the Paris Agreement
zum Beispiel das sondern ein neues Jus cogens und das wird auch geschützt, ganz ausdrücklich.
And that's also protected.
Wiener Vertragsrechtskonvention. Das heißt, diese Entwicklung ist geregelt und das anwenden und dann ist dieses
something that we can apply and then it's done and over with. So why are we not doing that? Italy, we could talk to Italy, they could submit this and this would be over and done with. Well, thank you so much. I'll pass this on. Now I'd like to invite the last speaker to speak before we conclude, but that was quite interesting. Gianna Rosa Marino, or the other way around. Marino, Gianna Rosa, maybe. I apologize.
My Italian is not existing. Marino, you had to switch on your microphone.
Okay, so what do you want me to speak, English or German?
You can speak whatever you want as soon as it's Italian, because then we are in trouble.
No, it is not important. So I can speak English. No, the discussion was very interesting. So it's very interesting to know how difficult it is to protect the environment, and so how is difficult just to treat back for a misleading treaty, and so I listened very okay, with much interest. I don't know what to add to the discussion, which can be useful.
Okay, thank you. We take this compliment with pleasure, and I now suggest that we have another person, so let's give her the opportunity. We have the time. Martina Wöhler, bitte schön.
You have the floor. You need to unmute yourself. Miss Wöhler, Martina Wöhler? Are you there? Does it work? Is it working? Yes. Great. I am in the rural region at this point. I'm originally from somewhere else, but I find this very interesting because this is a region where we have a lot of coal areas and also coal mines. So above the earth mining, and the last one was closed down in Bottrop last year. So what does this mean exactly? In Germany, you can no longer mine for coal. There are no subsidies, there are no funds, no investment is available. So what does this mean? I mean, in Germany, you can you have the only possibilities to buy coal from outside. Mining for coal above ground was stopped last year. There have been amendments afterwards, and there are some situations where, like in Essen, suddenly there are new holes in the ground. But still, overall in Germany, it's not economically, doesn't make any sense economically speaking to use coal. And I think it's a good argument to say, well, it's not lucrative anymore. And I'm really surprised to see this, because why would companies say, let's continue for a couple of years, but well, you could say this, but it doesn't make any sense. It would only mean that villages will vanish. And what are their arguments to continue doing this? Well, thank you so much. With that, I would like to pass the floor to Jutta. Paulus, I think we have to wrap up soon, and we also have to say that in German, coal and lignite,
linguistic problems, which Jutta can perhaps also explain. However, I would suggest we make a final round and start obviously with our guests. Perhaps Lise wants to come in first and draw some conclusions. Please, Lise.
Maybe I'll just conclude on the points about withdrawal and strategies to affect the survival clause, just because that was a big part of the discussion in chats. But I do think that a coordinated withdrawal is legally possible, and that the governments could work together to modify the survival clause to eliminate its effects. And if an investor still tries to bring a case, that there are still kind of strategies before domestic courts to make recovery of any awards given more difficult and more risky. So I think that it might not be a single bullet that is the most effective, but it's important to try several things. And again, it's kind of not just an issue with the ECT, but thousands of these investment treaties that continue to be negotiated and signed and continue in force. So, but thanks again for the opportunity.
Thank you for being with us. Freek.
Yes, trying to think of some clever things to end with.
I can ask you something for
Sure.
the time being. I was thrilled by your point that RWE is claiming compensation from you. You are probably aware that RWE shares are often in public ownership. So in fact, it's now local authorities from North Rhine-Westphalia complaining asking for money from the Netherlands. Perhaps this could be a campaigning angle, which we have not yet fully exploited. We are already used to these sort of claims from Sweden by Vattenfall against Germany. So Germans were often complaining against this. But now I learned that German public actors are using their legal possibilities against our Dutch friends. Perhaps this is an interesting angle to campaigning. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree. That sounds like an interesting angle. Yeah, same or similar for Uniper, the other company that sues us, is majority owned by Fortum, the Finnish state-owned company. So it's states suing states in a way. That's definitely interesting. Earlier, you mentioned also the interest about the public debate in the Netherlands. And so maybe I can say a little bit about that. Like what I told you about the comment of the Christian Democrat member of parliament is also quite illustrative for how the public debate shifted. So getting sued is a great way of making the Energy Charter Treaty controversial. Unfortunately, it needs to come to that. But it definitely helps. And at the same time, I think also in the Netherlands, we still have a long way to go. The Netherlands has a solid tradition in the neoliberal policy, including investment protection. So it'll still take some effort to move us away from the Energy Charter Treaty and treaties like this. At the same time, and that is maybe interesting, you know, the Netherlands is of course known as a trading country with a long history of sailing the seas, etc. And in this trading country, it's no longer a given that a majority of the parties support new trade agreements. So like so CETA, the EU-Canada trade agreement, just barely made it through our parliament, our lower chamber of parliament, and is still in the Senate, and it's still a very close race whether it will be supported or voted down. Also, a majority in the Dutch parliament withdrew support from the EU-Mercosur agreement. It's not an agreement with ISDS, but it's still also in many other ways one of these neoliberal trade agreements. So even in a country like the Netherlands, support for these kinds of treaties can go down, and yeah, that maybe gives a bit of hope for the future.
Yeah, Cornelia, Neely, as you know, got to know you. I have to thank you as well, and I have to say, if can Europe ever have a funding problem? I learned you make the most aesthetic presentation slides ever, so you always have an alternative funding source. So Cornelia, please.
Designer. Yes, I will become a graphic designer one day. Yeah, thank you very much for this interesting discussion. Thanks for having me. I think the dangers of the treaty became amply clear, and I think we also discussed some solutions to tackling this problem. What is missing is the political will. And with that, I would like to end on an appeal to the audience to please go out and help us to expose this treaty to the world, because to be honest, not so many people have ever heard about the Energy Charter Treaty, nor have they heard about the few cases that have now been filed against countries trying to implement their climate commitments. I hope we will not wait until it is too late, because the time to act is now. And I think we really have to try and bring the urgency of this across before more of these cases are being filed and more governments are having to take the decision to either compensate their fossil fuel firms for doing the right thing or sticking to their old ways. And yeah, so it's really about convincing every single state that is a member of the Energy Charter Treaty that this is indeed a problem for the country itself, but also for other countries, and take the right conclusions, become part of a solution, a coalition of the unwilling to continue to be the vessels of this treaty.
Vielen Dank. Und da es jetzt um den politischen Handlungswillen ging, direkt zu
Thank you
Jutta.
so much. So, because as we were speaking about the political will, Jutta first and then Anna. Anna first and then Jutta. Thank you so much. I also learned a lot today, and I think the proposal from the Wiener agreement, or what you called it, should be used, and I think we need to apply international law for treaties and agreements like this. And I think it also ties in with the examples of slaves I gave to illustrate, and I think it's something we need to shed light on. Maybe Felix Eckert could draw up an expert's opinion. And I still owe you an answer to the coal question. Germany 2018 was one plant that was closed last. So lignite mining, underground mining was responsible for the problems. And already in the 1960s, this was an issue. German lignite was not able to compete on international markets because subsidies were necessary at the time already. So we need to differentiate brown coal from this. And of course, transport plays a role here, and it's a very low energy density. Even though we want to phase out coal by 2038, or at least that's what the German government stipulated. And still in this situation, Garzweiler, Hambach, those are the mining regions in Germany. They will get smaller. Garzweiler was supposed to phase out until 45, but now according to the federal government, this decision was taken back and reduced, and now the new phase out is until 38. The mines in Lausitz in eastern Germany will, however, run for much longer. So there's still coal here that will be burned. And whether this is competitive or not has a lot to do with the prices in European emission trade. That did not work for many years, and there was a reform in the last legislative period. And Sven also mentioned it. Ever since the financial actors are involved or have gotten on board, only since then we've seen this being effective. Well, thank you so much, Jutta, for supporting this. And now we'll continue with Anna immediately. Well, there's a lot, I learn a lot here, and this event has been extremely interesting for me, and I keep on learning. We're about to have general elections in Germany shortly, and leaving the ECT is part of our campaign, it's part of our program. That's what we'll fight for, and I think there will be also a shift in the German government. However, we have member states that oppose this, and it would be good to see German Parliament taking on a strong opinion here. Jutta and myself were working on the topic here in the European Parliament, and we brought in a change proposal last autumn. And there, at least, it's sad that the ECT does not go with the Paris Agreement. So that was a strong signal. We need to find the majorities now.
Also wir haben keine rechtliche Handhabe als Parlament.
We don't really have any legal measures we can take as a parliament. We can only exert pressure, and that's something we did and will continue to do. So many thanks also on my behalf to everyone. Also on my behalf, I'd like to say thank you, and I'll keep it short. Thank you. This was a very interesting discussion. I'd like to extend a warm words of thanks to our guests. This has helped us massively to further our debate when it comes to how to tackle the treaties, what we can do here legally. I think that's very interesting. Maybe Jutta can assist us here when it comes to drawing up experts' opinions. It would be interesting to find out what we could do here. What starting points are there? Now, looking at the reports of the IPCC, 1.5 1.5 degrees is the absolute mercury maximum, and everything above will cause a stir. Now, what does this mean? It means nothing else. It can only mean one thing. When we look at the claims, they will apply. This is the only thing that it means. We can now decide whether we would like to see economic and ecological damage happening, or should we try to prevent this, which will then result in billions of damages that will need to be paid out. And I think this example illustrates why progressive parties, a strong civil society, and anyone who's
gesagt wurde, die sind allerhöchst libertär. Die sind inhärent staatsfeindlich und demokratiefeindlich. Und das muss man auch immer wieder sagen, weil weil die grundlegenden Theoretiker, auf denen des Liberalismus vor solchen Verträgen mit Abscheu und Entsetzen die Flucht ergriffen hätten, die können sich nicht auf den Liberalismus berufen. Und ich finde wichtig, dass man das klar hat, sondern das ist eigentlich eine Position, die in den 90er Jahren mehrheitsfähig war, nämlich eine inhärente Staatsskepsis. Kluge Liberale wussten, dass es eine freie Gesellschaft nur in einem starken staatlichen Ordnungsrahmen gibt. Und davon zeugen diese Verträge leider nicht. So, insofern, wir werden daran arbeiten, dass wir aus dem Vertrag herauskommen. Und Anna hat schon gesagt, dass wir uns als deutsche Grüne dazu auch verpflichtet haben. Die europäischen Grünen sind sowieso auf dieser handelspolitischen Linie. Ich wünsche euch alles einen schönen Abend. Heute ist Fußball angesagt in Deutschland. Daran geht hier wenig vorbei. Es gibt Einzelne, die sich dem verweigern, aber mehrheitsfähig ist das nicht. Also, ich hoffe, heute Abend möge der Bessere gewinnen und vor allem die Regenbogenfahnen überall wehen, ob es nun die UEFA, dieser korrupte Verein, will oder nicht. Und soweit erstmal, Lise, du musst diese Bemerkung nicht verstehen. Wir haben ja eine riesige Diskussion, ob das Münchner Stadion, wo heute Ungarn gegen Deutschland spielt, mit Regenbogenfahnen angestrahlt werden soll. Und das hat die UEFA verboten. Eine letzte Bemerkung dazu noch, was ich daran so lustig finde, ist, dass dieser korrupte Verein UEFA Deutschland vorschreibt, wie es seine Stadien auszuleuchten hat. Also das ist schon eine ganz lustige Episode. So, in diesem Sinne viel Spaß. Ich hoffe, das Bier ist kalt gestellt. Alles Gute. Noch eine begeisterte Studentin von Ulrike Liebert, und zwar Nelly Maarfield hat sich hier jetzt auch geoutet. Super. Dankeschön. Tschüss. Bis zum nächsten Mal.